Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, Getting the Gist of CJIS. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. Before we begin, I did want to let everyone know that we are recording today's presentation, and we will be sending out an email with a link to the recording as well as a link to the slides. If there are any questions, we will save a little time at the end, but please go ahead and enter them into the Q&A chat. At this time, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Wes Dobry, who is our principal engineer here at Eclipsium. And Wes, the floor is all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Melissa. And good morning to everyone out there. So today I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the new requirements that came out with CJIS 592 and kind of dig into some of the specifics on them. So as Melissa said, my name's Wes Dobry. I'm a principal engineer over here at Eclipsium, which means I just get to go and get hands-on with the technology and end up with a lot of really fun projects that I get to work on. A little bit of my background is I'm a 20-year experienced expert in security and designing and architecting enterprise systems. So just as a little bit of an agenda, I want to go through first off, talk a little bit about the new CJIS requirements, the new deadline. I want to take a step back, define some terms that have been added into the CJIS components themselves. Then I want to deep dive into some specific controls, and I'll go into things like how quickly you have to remediate flaws, what that process needs to look like now based upon the new requirements, how to actually report against it, understanding how to analyze any threats like that within your environment. And Bill, if you don't mind muting for me. And then, of course, also how your team can understand security alerts, advisories, directives. And then lastly, defining and understanding what integrity means in relation to CJIS and ultimately how that applies to your organization. So first off, just taking a dive right into it. In late 2022, CJIS security policy was updated from 591 to 592. 591 was 259 pages of controls, so a pretty substantial amount of controls already. 592 jumped up to 356 pages of controls, so a 37.5% increase over the previous year. And ultimately where this increase came from is they defined a whole bunch more controls, started to dig in deeper into specifically how to implement your processes and understand things that are occurring. And this ultimately aligns closer with things like NIST SP 800 SP 853, for instance, and dives into more of those specifics about how to actually manage things in details. So when we actually look at 592, there was an entire section added here. So as you read through it, all the things in red are ultimately the things that have been added into the CJIS security policy, as you guys probably well know. Now, some of the things that were added that are very, very interesting are some new terms, things like firmware and things like integrity. And so as we dive through these specific components, today I'm going to focus on firmware and predominantly integrity, but they've also added some other things that you might want to take a look at around specific controls related to spam, information input, how you handle error messages, retention policies, and ultimately as a whole, aligning closer to things like with NIST 800. So the big thing and the thing to understand is that while CJIS 592 was released on 12/7 or 224 days ago, the deadline that they gave for implementation of these new controls and for them to become auditable is October 1st. So that's only 73 days from now. So I'm assuming that if you're here, this may be an introduction to these controls, and a lot of this may be new. Now, with the detail that they've extrapolated on in these specific controls, there are new tools that likely need to be investigated and purchased, as well as understanding how this impacts specific processes that you may have in your organization today. They do deeper definition of things like how quickly you need to remediate flaws, for instance, which I'll talk about here in a couple minutes. But these things go together to possibly change things that you're already doing and tighten things up. And we all need to make sure that with 73 days to go for it to be auditable, we at least have this in the back of our minds for how we're going to go and solve this. Additionally, I know a lot of organizations that are CJIS related have an October 1st budget year. This is also a good opportunity to start planning to go and make sure that there's money carved out in next year's budget cycle for any tools that you may need to purchase, or of course, any services that you need to purchase. So I want to take a step back and define one of the terms that's used in CJIS 592, and that's firmware. And when we look at IT devices predominantly, and we think about the term firmware, a lot of us that have been around for a little while refer to firmware as the BIOS of a machine. And we think about a computer and we think, oh, well, if we're talking about firmware, we just need to update just the BIOS itself. But nowadays, that's not really true. Machines and computers and networking equipment have gotten way more complex over the years. And now we have lots more areas of opportunity for nefarious bad actors to do their nefarious fun stuff they do. So that's things like now we have areas where we have to manage and maintain CPU microcode. We may have an entire Linux operating system running on a bare metal or a baseboard management controller. Or we even have things like manufacturers shipping devices with solid state disks that have a firmware bug in them that causes a solid state disk to fail at 32,000 hours. And so now, from an enterprise perspective, we need to monitor, maintain, and understand this level of firmware at a much greater detail level. And that's ultimately where these new CJIS controls come from. Because as we look at what this term of firmware is, it sort of morphs a little bit. Now it has all of those individual components I was just speaking about. But if we look at things like our network appliances, both physical and virtual, this now expands to looking at things like the full operating system on something like a network switch. Or if we have something like a load balancer or a VPN concentrator, or all of these different things that we all have within our networks, now firmware also includes the running operating system on those things. And again, as we start to dig into these definitions, this starts to go and mean that these processes that we have to put in place are actually a lot more complicated than we initially thought. So one of the things that we've found as taking a look at things like CISA, or the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency's known exploited vulnerabilities report, is that over the last few years, the actively exploited vulnerabilities out in the wild are starting to fall into different categories. And what we've seen is an emerging category, and is now actually the largest vulnerability category with known in the wild exploits, is actually firmware. And again, that takes the definition of it could be something dealing with Intel ME or UEFI. It could also be something dealing with a Cisco Firepower firewall, for instance, or a Palo Alto device, or something along those lines too. But this is a huge area where we need to take a look at and verify that these devices are safe and secure and are not an avenue for these bad actors to get into our networks. So let's look at how some of these new controls actually apply and why they've made the changes that they have done, and as well as simplify some of the language that are in them. So first off, the first control I want to talk about is SI2, and that's around flaw remediation, or specifically flaw remediation timing. And so you'll see that they've said, we want you to install security relevant software and firmware updates. So now it's no longer just software updates. They've added that you have to manage and maintain firmware updates within a certain number of days after the release. So this means that not only do we need to manage firmware of all of our things like our desktops, laptops, and servers, we also need to make sure that we are patching the operating system on all of our network appliances within this same time frame. It also means that even if we have firmware updates that are released, there may still be vulnerabilities in the updates or in the devices even after they're completely patched. So even though we may need to patch something within 15 days of an update, if there are not vulnerabilities in place, we also need to be prepared to put compensating controls in place. And that could be things all the way up to collection of a certain type of device and replace it with a different type of device if necessary in a severe enough case. So ultimately, though, these vulnerabilities take a long time to be released. And once they are released, we need to be prepared and have processes in place to roll out these updates very, very quickly. So in this case of something like a critical update, which often applies in things like SSL updates and things like that, we need to be able to roll those out within 15 days after their release, which is very expeditious, especially when we have devices that are in the field connected over LTE and things like that. The second one that's also within flaw remediation is the actual process. And a lot of times from a corporation perspective, we haven't really thought about how we're going to deploy firmware and manage firmware at scale. This is something that needs to be thought of and integrated into your configuration management processes, especially now since there's language associated to firmware within CJIS. It also means that if, again, we don't have something that fixes a flaw, we need to be able to implement necessary compensating controls. And again, that could be things like network isolation, device collection, other tools that can monitor in greater detail to let us know if there's indicators of attack or indicators of compromise in place. And ultimately to understand everything that's occurring from not only an OS and software perspective, but now also hardware and firmware. Now, then they expand upon and they've added around automated flaw remediation status. And they've said determining if these security relevant software and firmware updates, making sure that they're actually in place. And one of the things that we need to do about that is understanding that we now need to understand that our vulnerability scanning tools are looking at the things within scope for CJIS now. And when we look at things like most network vulnerability scanners, they don't look at a lot of the components beyond the operating system, drivers, software, and potentially for some of them, maybe even validation of UEFI and BIOS from a version perspective. But ultimately, what we do see is that there's a large amount of firmware that is not scanned to the density of what CJIS requires now, and that needs to be accommodated for and understood to make sure that you're in compliance. Additionally, they've also added that you must now employ tools and mechanisms to support near real-time analysis of events. Now, events is a key term here. That's identification of anything that may be occurring on the device at the time of whether a tool understands it, an action occurs. We need to have full understanding of what that means on all of our machines and systems. So now need to understand that whatever solution that you use to manage things like firmware updates, it must integrate with your SIM and SOAR or log aggregation tools to provide workflows around indicators of compromise, indicators of attack, events, and alerts. It also means that if our tools for visibility and understanding any risks, so our vulnerability scanning tools or anything that may identify these vulnerabilities on all of our devices, also needs to integrate with your event and alert solution so that you can, again, have a full understanding and reporting of all of these potential CJIS related risks to your organization. So they also have added a component around that you must subscribe to security alerts, advisories, and directives from things like external sources. So whether that be CISA or MSISAC or US CERT, or things like your OEM hardware software providers. It also means that we just need to maintain and make sure that we understand what's actually occurring out in the industry, and we have a regular real-time feed of these types of incidents and issues. One of the things that I do want to make sure that everyone here is aware of is that Eclipsium actually publishes a quarterly threat report that looks at some of the most advanced and nefarious attacks that are seen in the wild. We also talk through strategic vision about where these attacks are going and try to stay ahead of what's actually out there. We also talk a little bit about things like how to protect things like your supply chain and validate that your devices are not compromised. But all of this comes together that if you haven't signed up for this and aren't part of our below the surface threat report, I highly recommend that you do that to go and help make sure that you're meeting this SI5 and understand the latest and greatest security alerts. So now let's get into the fun control. And this is the one that has a whole lot of new language and new information around it. And this is SI7. SI7 within the document takes up a substantial amount of the new pages added. And specifically, they're starting to use some new terms here: software, firmware, and information integrity. And this is where some things start to get a little interesting, because this is a dramatic increase from CJIS 591. In CJIS 592, now that we look at these specific terminology and these controls, it now means that we have a lot of additional things that we need to do as organizations. So the first part is when they say detect unauthorized changes, this means that now you must monitor all changes to firmware and firmware configuration. So that means that you have to have a tool that is looking at every specific piece of firmware on a device and understanding if it has changed, detecting any unauthorized changes, and notifying you accordingly with integration to your other SOC workflows or things like your SIM and source systems. And they've also used a new term here: integrity verification. And integrity, I like to simplify and say, that is understanding and validating a known good state and monitoring for any and all changes against baseline. So this is ultimately where, when we start to look at what they're asking for here, we need to be able to understand what's changed. And then after it has changed, is verifying that it's no known good. So this is no longer a scenario of, okay, a firmware update's applied, we think we got it from the OEM. This is now a step has to occur that we have to verify things that are out in the field to understand exactly what's occurring and what's out there. So this now means that we need to know that that UEFI component on that Panasonic Toughbook laptop is exactly what we think it is. It also means that this solution now, if we take a look at this notify and incident response terminology, it must be included within your incident response processes. So that means that if we do get a notification of something like an unknown piece of firmware or an indicator of compromise within a piece of firmware, software, or any other informational system, that needs to have some kind of a process where people are notified and a response is actually catered to that specific event. So again, if some tool that you're using to monitor firmware goes and validates and says, hey, this firmware is not what we expect it to be, you need to understand what that process is. Do we collect a device? What do we do once we've collected the device? How do we understand what the blast radius of that specific incident is? And then, of course, also making sure that we do all the reasonable research for how it may have occurred. So now I'm going to take a little bit of a different step and talk about how these specific controls can be adapted and corrected in a relatively quick fashion. And that's ultimately where Eclipsium and what we provide comes into play. And a very simple and easy way to think about Eclipsium itself is that we're simply put below the operating system, and I break it into three pieces: visibility, integrity, and security. Visibility is understanding the assets that your organization has. That's what pieces of hardware do you have? what components are they made up on? So what individual pieces of hardware are within those systems, as well as what firmware is running on them. So that's understanding that that Panasonic laptop is running UEFI version such and such as an example. But then we also go deeper and look at the security of that device and the firmware itself. So understand what vulnerabilities may exist in that piece of hardware and those pieces of firmware. That's also looking for things like misconfigurations of the device as well. So if we see something change that may lower the security of the device, let's report that and make sure that you're aware of it. Lastly is around the integrity side of things. And this lines up specifically with the CJIS terminology, where we validate known good firmware. So instead of saying your Panasonic Toughbook has version 123 of UEFI on it, we actually extract that from the device, compare it against known goods so that we know it's exactly what it says it is. Lastly, that's also tracking change. So from the time that you receive the device to the time that you retire it, we extract every piece of firmware from it and monitor that for change throughout the entire life cycle of the device. So again, this really breaks into two pieces. First is assessing new devices, understanding that the hardware is genuine, making sure there's no unknown risks when we bring it into your organization. And then second is regularly assessing and patching that device firmware. So again, operationalizing the firmware components or everything below the operating system on all of your devices inside of your organization. This all comes together ultimately to build a zero trust architecture when we talk about your endpoints, laptops, desktops, servers, and networking equipment. An easy way that I like to think about how organizations are doing things today is most organizations that I talk to, they do the areas in green very, very well. We focus on protecting the users from themselves and using tools like our EDRs, our XDRs, our network vulnerability scanners to focus within the user space and understand exactly what's happening there from a security perspective with defense in depth architecture. These tools rarely, if at all, go into the areas in red here, where ultimately that's where Eclipsium sits. Again, think of us as complementary to existing EDR, XDR solutions, where we take that perspective of everything below the OS and complement that and fill in the gaps of where your existing defense in depth architecture is likely not even looking. And an easy way that I like to think about this is breaking this into three parts. Onboarding section where we assess the device before it even goes and touches anything critical or important within your network by baselining the device, establishing trust within it. Then we move into continuous monitoring where we can do regular posture checking, change tracking, integrity verification. And then lastly is around the remediation side where we're performing the firmware updates, we're integrating with your SIM and SOAR to make sure that we sync in with your existing workflows within your organization and make sure everyone is communicated and notified appropriately depending upon what we've found within that device. So let's take a little moment and wrap up the things that I've mentioned thus far today. So ultimately, first and foremost, CJIS 592 has a deadline of 10/1 before it becomes auditable. That again is in 73 days from now. Now, while that's not a deadline for having everything implemented, as we all know, once it becomes auditable, if something happens and we get audited, that's a situation where we want to make sure we at least have a framework of these controls in place. The next is the new term for firmware within CJIS 592. And an easy way to think about that is code below the operating system or the complete operating system on something like a network appliance that you can't manage. We need to make sure that, of course, that is taken care of and all of the additional controls take into perspective the firmware components. Additionally, we also know that there was an entire section of controls added, almost 100 pages worth or over 100 pages worth of new controls. And they ultimately define as we need to patch early and often. We now have tighter timelines for patching critical vulnerabilities. We also need to expand the scope of what's being patched to understand that that includes network appliances as well as firmware on physical hardware. We also know that this firmware must be integrated as part of your existing configuration management and patch management processes. We've also added the control around that we need to regularly scan for firmware vulnerabilities in addition to our software and operating system vulnerabilities as well. Now we need to be looking at firmware, and that firmware again takes the definition that this also applies for things like networking equipment. This also means that we need to have our scanner or whatever we're using to find these vulnerabilities integrated with our SIM and SOAR and notification processes, as well as our incident management processes to understand exactly what's happening, make sure everyone is communicated appropriately. I also mentioned a little bit about our threat report that I highly encourage you to sign up for if you haven't already, to get a regular quarterly update about what we see as emerging threats and making sure that you're ahead of the game on how to protect yourself for it. And then lastly, we also need to make sure that with the largest control, SI7, to understand how we can monitor for change and validate against known good on software, firmware, and hardware components themselves. So with that, I want to say thank you. I wanted to keep today's webinar on the short side of things. And ultimately, if you have any questions or any information that you'd like to dig into deeper, please go out to our website. If you go out to eclipsium.com/demo, it'll reach out to us, and I'm happy to have a follow-up conversation to talk about this in greater detail for anything you've seen, or of course, go into how Eclipsium can help.
Thank you, Wes. And I want to thank everyone again for taking the time out of their day to join us today. Like I'd said, we will be following up with a link to the recording and the slides, and we wish everyone to have a great day. Thank you for joining us.